So we're picking up in our Chapter 28 video notes with the Great Depression, 1929 to 1939. Notice this is the start date for World War II, which is what pulled the United States, for one, out of the Great Depression. So the economic crisis. Even though economic activity was declining slowly in many countries by 1929, the crash of the stock market in the U.S. In October of that year initiated a worldwide crisis. And that's not to say that the crash of the stock market caused it, but it just was one event that sparked many other events. So net investment, people who had invested in factories, farms, equipment, that kind of thing, all of that fell from $3.5 billion in 1925 to $3.2 billion in 1929, while the value of shares traded on the exchanges soared from $27 billion to $87 billion. And such inflated prices should have raised concerns about the stability of the economy, but there were a lot of experts who failed to predict the collapse that was coming. And part of the problem is that investors were buying stocks on margin. And when you buy on margin, you pay some of the purchase price and then you borrow the remainder from the stockbroker. And so as the stock market began to decline, they were forced to sell their shares in order to pay off their brokers when the prices started falling. So the problem was when thousands of people started selling their stocks at once, and the result was financial panic, and investors and speculators were wiped out in a matter of days or weeks. And at this point, they were pretty much stripped of their wealth and their confidence, and they started buying fewer goods. Prices fell, production slowed down, and unemployment rose. And pretty soon, the entire American economy was caught in this downward spiral. And once the panic broke out, New York bankers began recalling their loans, which made it really difficult for business people to borrow money. And this caused a panicky public to withdraw its savings from the banks, causing a run on the banks. That is when a bunch of people pull their money out all at once, and it forces the bank to collapse pretty much. And so the financial crisis led to a general crisis in production. Between 1929 and 1933, just 4 years, the world output of goods fell by about 38%. And so country after country followed the example of the United States and raised protective tariffs to their highest levels ever. Protective tariffs, once again, you put a tax or a duty on imports so people will buy locally. And these actions limited international trade. One of the crucial factors in this slide to the bottom from 1929 to 1933 was that the international economy lacked the leadership able to maintain stability when the crisis came. And another important factor was the poor national economic policy in almost every country. Again, this was unprecedented. Governments really didn't know what to do with this. And in many instances, governments cut their budgets when they maybe should have raised spending and run some deficits in order to stimulate their economies. So all of this, of course, led to mass unemployment. The lack of large-scale government spending contributed to the rise of massive unemployment. And large-scale unemployment caused a dramatic increase in poverty, even though in most countries, unemployed workers did receive some type of unemployment benefits or some type of public aid that would at least prevent starvation. At any rate, homes and just the general way of life was completely disrupted in millions of personal tragedies. Young people postponed marriages, birth rates fell sharply, and suicide and mental illness increased dramatically. So the New Deal in the United States. So when the Great Depression began, the President of the United States was Herbert Hoover, and he and his administration responded to the stock market crash with optimism. but no action. Herbert Hoover did not believe in just giving out money to people. He encouraged private companies and corporations to help with the situation, the effects of the Depression, but he himself was not willing to give away money or to expand the government in that type of a fashion. There was really, was it even constitutional? I don't know, but Herbert Hoover was not willing to do that. And so he really wasn't a very popular president because he didn't really do anything. So between 1929 and 1932, banks are failing, unemployment's skyrocketing, industrial production is falling by about 50%. And so in 1932, FDR, or Franklin Delano Roosevelt, won a landslide presidential victory. And he won without any real plan. Like, he had the New Deal, but it wasn't a set plan. It was very vague, and he promised hope. He did say he wanted to reform capitalism in order to preserve it. And because he was willing to try something, people voted for him. Roosevelt did reject socialism and government ownership of industry, but he did advocate forceful government intervention in the economy, and he did institute a broad range of government-supported social programs that would be designed to stimulate the economy and provide jobs for ordinary people. One of his top priorities was federal programs that would promote agricultural recovery. Another thing Roosevelt did was he took the United States off of the gold standard. This devalued the dollar in an effort to raise American prices and to rescue farmers. There was a major problem of overproduction of farm products that drove farm prices way, way, way down. So farmers couldn't pay back their loans on their tractors because farm goods were worth nothing. And there were surpluses of farm goods sitting in warehouses. So most of the federal programs geared toward farmers was setting a production limit, saying, hey, you can only produce this many barrels of wheat or whatever it was. The most ambitious attempt to control and plan the economy was the National Recovery Administration, or the NRA, and this just put a whole bunch of money into public works projects or government, basically giving out jobs. The NRA was so expansive that it was actually declared unconstitutional in 1935. But pretty much the federal government just went ahead and employed directly as many people as was financially possible. They created new agencies like the Works Progress Administration to undertake all types of public works projects that included constructing public buildings and bridges and highways. In 1935, the government also established a national social security system with old age pensions and unemployment benefits. The National Labor Relations Act of 1935 declared that collective bargaining would be the policy of the United States. Basically, employees could negotiate their wages and hours with their employer. So, in general, between 1935 and 1938, the government rulings and social reforms sort of chipped away at the privileges of the wealthy and tried to help the ordinary people. Despite the accomplishments in the social reform, the New Deal was only partly successful, and it didn't really pull the United States out of the Great Depression. It would take the Second World War for that to happen. The Scandinavian response to the Depression. So the Scandinavian countries under social democratic leadership probably responded most successfully to the challenge of the Great Depression. In the 1920s, the Social Democrats in Sweden and Norway passed some reform legislation for both peasants and workers and developed a flexible but non-revolutionary kind of socialism. And so the socialist governments in this area built on a strong tradition of cooperative community action, and they pioneered the use of large-scale deficits, spending money they don't have, to finance public works. And so they were able to maintain production and maintain employment. And they were probably, them and the USSR, shockingly, were probably the least affected by the Great Depression. And all of this spending did require a large bureaucracy and high taxes, first on the rich and then on practically everyone else. But private and corporate enterprise thrived, as did democracy. So recovery and reform in Britain and France. So in Britain, MacDonald's Labour government and then the conservative-dominated coalition government after 1931 followed orthodox economic theory in 1, balancing the budget, 2, controlling spending, and 3, giving out the bare minimum of welfare to unemployed workers. And so in the years after 1932, they were actually somewhat better off for Britain than the 1930s had been, which was sort of opposite of the situation in the United States and France. Britain concentrated increasingly on the national market rather than the international market, so focusing on Great Britain rather than foreign trade. They also focused on new industries like automobiles and electrical appliances, which grew in response to the British home demand. And since there were low interest rates, there was actually a housing boom. People were buying houses like crazy. So in France, France was less industrialized and more isolated from the world economy. So the Great Depression came later for them, but when it did come, it lingered. And so economic stagnation in France both reflected and heightened the ongoing political crisis, as there was no stability in the government. The moderate republicanism in France was weakened greatly by opposition from the Communist Party, who looked to Stalin's Russia for guidance, and also by attacks from fascist-type organizations in France that looked to Mussolini's Italy and Hitler's Germany for inspiration. And so they were frightened by the growing strength of the fascists at home and abroad. So the communists, the socialists, and the radicals formed an alliance called the Popular Front. And for the national elections of May 1936, they won a clear victory that reflected the trend toward polarization. So in order to deal with the social and economic problems of the 30s, the Popular Front, again, the alliance of communist, socialists, and radicals, their government, led by a guy named Leon Blum, a socialist, encouraged the union movement and launched a far-reaching program of social reform, complete with paid vacations and a 40-hour work week. This was sabotaged really quickly by rapid inflation and cries of revolution by the fascists in France and the frightened conservatives. And so Blum was forced to announce a break in social reform when France entered a severe financial crisis. Furthermore, political dissension in France was encouraged by the Spanish Civil War that was taking place, 1936 to 39. And during this time, authoritarian fascist rebels overthrew the democratically elected Republican government in Spain. And so in France, extremism began to grow, and France itself was within sight of civil war. And so Blum was forced to resign in June of 1937, and the Popular Front quickly collapsed. So we'll go ahead and bring this to an end, and in chapter 29, we'll pick up with World War II.